So this presentation, it's called Restoration Landscapes, and I'm going to be talking about what I've learned over the last 10 years running my own landscape and construction company called HomeHarvest Edible Landscapes and Construction. And I'll be talking about soil health, edible garden design, and why it's important to all of us and how we can all play a role in creating a more positive and connected with nature future, which will ultimately be healthier for us all. So restoration, it means to give back, to return, to bring back into a former or original state. We used to live with nature. We used to see nature with reverence, and we used to farm. We used to be connected to our food source, and in many ways we used to be healthier. So I'm going to be talking about how can we restore our landscapes so that we can live in more harmony. To solve climate change, we really need to first understand the root problem. And I don't think that the words climate change or global warming, to me, are particularly inspiring, because what can one person do with these large global problems? And the answer is one person can do a lot. We need to realize that the problem is a loss of biodiversity. Species extinction is a big problem. The problem is a lack of reverence for the natural world, a lack of connection to nature. These things inspire me a lot more than the words climate change and global warming. 18 million acres are deforested every year. That's 20 football fields per minute. And agriculture is the leading cause. But we all need to eat. We eat every day. I ate today. Most people eat. So how can we live more sustainably? That's really the question. And we're the leaders. If you look around at the people in this room, the people at this event, we're the leaders. And how we take action is actually the most important. We're not the victims, we're the creators, we're the leaders, and everything that we do, it really matters. So sustainability, it's all about conserving an ecological balance by avoiding the depletion of our natural resources. And like everything, it's a sort of a gray area. So to the one side of the sustainability spectrum, we're destroying our environment, we're deforesting, we're killing all the plants and we're just planting corn or beans, or worse, we're just planting lawn and we're not even using that lawn. And then to the other side of the sustainability spectrum, we're growing our own food and we're engaging in that process. But we have jobs and we can't just grow our own food all the time, so we're somewhere in the gray area. But I do think that if we exist more to one side of the spectrum, more to the connection with nature side of the spectrum, ultimately we are actually much more healthier as a result. So we need to benefit the planet. We need to benefit the ecosystem. We need to benefit the community and the people. But we also need to make a profit, and all of these things are important. This is part of the concept of what's called the triple bottom line. And at the heart of that is sustainability, it's regenerative agriculture, it's restoration, and it's stewardship over our shared ecosystem. We're all part of this ecosystem. And the good news is that food that you grow yourself, it actually tastes better and it's actually healthier for you. That's part of the reason we have taste buds. Have you ever had a cherry tomato from your garden, or a pea from your garden, or a carrot from your garden, and it's actually significantly tastier than what you can buy at the supermarket? That's because the nutrient density correlates with the sweetness of the produce. So it actually tastes better and it's better for you. So then the question becomes, how can I grow food sustainably? And how can I mimic nature's efficiencies? And that's a really important question to ask, because the most sustainable systems are mimicking efficiencies that are already present in nature. We just need to know how to observe these systems and how to replicate them. Has anyone seen someone fertilizing or irrigating a forest? Has anyone walked into the fells and seen someone spraying the trees or watering the trees? No. So why is that? Why are there these robust systems that exist in nature with very little human input, yet most of our agricultural systems require such immense effort? There is a way to model our systems based off of nature, and it starts with observing nature and connecting with nature. So for example, this photo, I think this actually was taken at the fells. Who deals with the leaves? Who deals with all that waste? No one. It just gets recycled back into the ecosystem. Why is it that when fall comes, we rake up all of our leaves and we get rid of it? That's actually free fertilizer. Now, obviously, we need to take aesthetics into consideration. But we can learn a few things from nature. We can replicate a lot of things from nature. And our gardens will be more resilient and more beautiful as a result. So part of understanding how to work with nature is understanding what is soil. I had a really awesome soils professor who I'm grateful for in college, and he summarized it really simply, saying, soil, it's just bits of rock on their way to the ocean, in its most simplistic terms. And there's a lot of truth to that, and there's organic matter, and there's nutrients, and there's pH, and there's all sorts of other things to understand. But really, the concept is, soil is moving on its way to the ocean, whether we want it to or not. It's always in a state of erosion. The soil in our raised bed, the soil in our backyard, the soil on top of a mountain, it's working its way down to the ocean. And it could take a few years, it could take a few months, it could take a few million years. It's in our best interest to hold on to that soil and to respect that soil and to see that soil with reverence, because that soil is actually why we're here. It's why we're alive. It's why the planet is able to support such a large population. We stand in most places on Earth only 6 inches from desolation, for that is the thickness of the topsoil level upon which the entire life of the planet depends. When you see bare soil, exposed soil, it's going to erode faster, and that's going to result in us not being able to use that soil for agricultural use or whatever use that we want. And again, our health is proportional to the health of the soil, so we ought to take this seriously. We can't just live off fish, and we're overfishing the oceans anyway, so we have to work with soil. Hydroponics is certainly an option, but that's not going to feed billions of people in the way we might need it to, and then those nutrients need to come from somewhere. So these living systems working with soil, this is why we're able to live. Healthy soil is very much alive. There's over 4 billion microbes in just 1 teaspoon of healthy soil. And this diverse soil food web can actually contribute to the nutrient density of the food, and that makes us healthier as a result. So I want to quickly go over some soil health basics in case anyone wants to try growing their own food, and this is applicable to ornamental gardens as well. So keep the soil covered. When you see bare soil that's exposed, it's prone to erosion, and it's just not going to stick around. So keep roots in the ground, whether it's trees or shrubs or perennials or flowers or edibles. Minimize soil disturbance as much as you can. And see the soil with respect, because it's very much alive. It really is living and breathing, so try to see the soil with life and treat it that way. So there's 3 types of organic matter, and organic matter is really important, especially if you want to grow food organically. There's the living type of organic matter. That's us. That's also plants, insects, anything that's alive. There's the dead or the recently dead. That's the leaves that just fell off the trees. That's the compost you just added to your vegetable garden. That's the mulch that you apply to your gardens in the spring. And then there's the very dead. There's that layer of humus. So if we were to fill this room up with compost, in 10 years we'd be left with a very low, maybe 2-foot high level of humus. That's finished compost. That's the very dead. In an ideal situation, our vegetable gardens or our living ecosystems have a combination of all 3. The living, the dead, the very dead. That's an important concept if you want to grow food organically. If you want to just add Miracle-Gro, you can bypass this, but that's not sustainable on a really large scale. So compost can be added to the soil surface, it can be mixed into the soil, or it can be added as the plants are growing, meaning it's a very flexible soil amendment that you can really add any time of year. And it always provides quite a few nutrients, and it provides water holding capacity, and it generally makes the plants healthier as a result. So if you want to grow more food or more flowers or more of whatever you want to grow, add compost to your soil. Abundant organic matter is ideal. Compost your leaves. Save your fertility on site. If you want to make it look attractive, you could try composting it in a pile. You could try running over it with a lawnmower to make it more homogeneous and uniform. Last year we sold several hundred cubic yards of leaf mulch. You can make this stuff yourself. It's just leaves. Grind it up a little bit, or just rake it under some shrubs, or compost it in a compost bin, or just rake it into the corner of your property, into the woods. It's better than just getting rid of it. This is free fertility that we can all be capitalizing on. So I want to quickly talk about limestone. We're in New England, where it rains a good amount, and that results in acidic soil. So if you've ever heard about acidic soil, the best remedy to that is adding limestone. It might cost $10, $20 to add enough limestone to a garden the size of this room. So it's fairly inexpensive material, and you get a lot of benefits. You get calcium, magnesium, you increase the nutrient availability of the soil, but most of all, you reduce aluminum toxicity. There's a lot of aluminum in our soil here, and it is toxic for plants. Some plants will die if you plant it straight into the native soil here because it's fairly acidic. So add some limestone. You only need to really do this once every 3 or 4 years. If you take soil samples, they'll tell you exactly how much limestone to add. But we're not talking about a large expense, and we're not talking about a lot of material either. It's very easy to do this. So add limestone to pretty much any plants that you're growing, except for blueberries. They don't like limestone. That's an exception. Rhododendrons, azaleas, acid-loving plants, these are exceptions. But generally speaking, any sort of edibles that you want to grow, any fruit trees, any berries, they're going to benefit from some limestone. I highly recommend you test your soil. If you're interested in growing food, it's a really good idea to do. I have soil test forms up here. It costs $15. It takes about 20 minutes. It tells you how much limestone to add. It tells you what the pH is, which is relative to how much limestone to add. It tells you what nutrients might be deficient. It gives you crop-specific information. But most of all, it tells you, is there lead in your soil? And there's a lot of lead in the Boston area. We find lead contamination in over half the sites that we test. I've been doing this 10 years. So that means there's hundreds of contaminated sites around Arlington that we're aware of. And there's probably thousands that we're not aware of. So I highly recommend you take some soil samples. And you'll get something that looks like this. In this example, less than 22 parts per million lead is deemed safe, and this site has 1,140 parts per million lead. I would like to say that this is uncommon, but it's not. It's very common, and this is common because of lead paint. It's because of fungicides that were applied hundreds of years ago, and they're persistent in the soil. The good news is it's fairly easy to deal with. But it's common in this area. It's a harmful neurotoxin. It's linked to mental disorders, and it results from leaded gas or paint chips or fungicides that were applied. And it can be inhaled in the form of dust. And some plants can actually absorb the lead, such as carrots or other root crops. So the best thing you can do is know that the soil is contaminated, first of all, and then mulch your soil. Just cover it. Cover it with compost. Cover it with loam, soil, any sort of barrier, any sort of ground cover. Plant it densely, prevent on a dry, windy day, prevent it from becoming airborne and breathing it in. We find a lot of clients just don't know that there's lead in the soil, and their young kids are playing in the soil, or worse, the client's pregnant and she doesn't know, and she's digging in the soil and not washing her hands and actually ingesting that lead. Once the lead makes it into your brain, it's very difficult to detox. So it's something that's easy to test for, $15. The test forms are right up here. The best thing you can do is grow in raised beds, bring in clean soil. Leafy greens, root crops, and mushrooms can absorb lead like a sponge, so be extra careful with those crops. Fruit trees generally don't have as much issue with lead. Fruiting crops, blueberries, strawberries, apples, peaches, plums, nectarines, any sort of fruit you want to grow, the lead generally does not go into the fruit. It goes into the leaves and into the roots. But if you have a lot of organic matter in your soil, and if you've added limestone, and you have adequate phosphorus, which comes from the compost, the probability that your plants are absorbing that lead is very low. So good soil health practices will minimize the risk of lead. But generally, just cover it. Cover the lead so that you're not breathing it in. Make sure that if you're growing food in the ground, you're at least aware of it. And children and pregnant women are especially at risk. So I really recommend you get your soil tested. We need to respect soil. We need to see soil as a living, breathing entity. And look at the difference between these two photos. We give trees this little tiny area in the middle of a sidewalk, and we expect them to thrive, and oftentimes they don't. And then you give them just a little bit more space, and they really take off. So our cities can be more beautiful. Our landscapes can be more beautiful if we respect soil and we give plants the space that they need, especially in an urban environment. And if we teach this to our children, that's really exciting. When children are aware of the importance of soil and they're out there and they're watering the raised beds or they're sowing the seeds. In this case, this daughter of one of our clients actually planted all of these plants in this photo. And that's really exciting when we're able to empower customers and then they empower their children. That ripple effect is quite positive. So now talking about all of the positives of soil, there are some obstacles, and Norway maples are a pretty big obstacle. Has anyone had experience with Norway maples? Yeah, the hand shot right up. Yeah, so these trees are relatively invasive. They're invasive, and they have very dense, shallow surface roots. They take all the nutrients out of your garden. So I'm all about being nice to trees, planting more trees, but not this one. If you have a Norway maple on your property and it's relatively small, like kill it and then plant something that's better, because there's a lot of better trees that will grow. There are a lot of native trees that will grow. There are a lot of fruit trees to consider. And I love trees. So the way you know it's a Norway maple is when you break off a leaf, you see this milky sap. The reality is, if right here, this is the drip line of the tree, the roots from this tree can go over 10 or 20 times past the drip line. So you could have a Norway maple in a corner of your property and it's sucking nutrients out of your compost bin or your raised beds or invading your flower gardens. So this is one of the only trees that I usually recommend removing. And if ethics is a problem, plant 5 trees in its place and you'll be happier you did that. So I want to move on to talking about design considerations. And it's really important that you ask the right questions. So much of garden design and design in general is about asking the right questions about budget, sunlight, water access, soil health, limitations, winter, and thinking creatively about how you can really maximize the space. What are your goals? What do you want to grow? What do you want to look at? How much food do you want to harvest? How much can you realistically harvest? 20 fruit trees, that's a lot of fruit. 10 raised beds, that's a lot of produce. Can you actually deal with that much food? Does it make sense to start small and then work your way up? How much time do you have? What will make you come alive? What will be really exciting to grow? These are all questions to think about. And then start thinking creatively about how you can really maximize the space and maximize the materials. When people think about what a fence can be used for, they're thinking about it as a barrier or a privacy screen. But what about safety? What about a garden trellis? What about a way to grow grapes or hardy kiwi or hops or roses? What about a windbreak? What about frost protection? Frost moves downhill, and if you have a fence on the upper side of your property, it's possible you can protect your tender pea tendrils that just were germinated. What about livestock management? What about shade and growing shiitake mushrooms on the north side of that fence? What about an attractive feature or a sound barrier? How many functions can each design element serve? Try to think about everything in your landscape this way, and it'll be more beautiful and more holistic and more connected. This is a beautiful sculpture that we built. It's also a privacy screen. It's also very attractive. It's also growing grapes. It's also helping to enclose a social space. So there's multiple things going on in each design element, and that's ideal. What can a road be used for, or a patio, or a walkway? Usually it's just driving or walking. But what about a plant barrier containing your mint or your running bamboo that would just spread out and take over your whole property? What about heat storage, capturing the heat off of that road and growing figs and allowing them to ripen a little bit sooner, or your peppers getting a higher yield because of that different microclimate? What about water catchment? What about a fire break? Try to imagine the potential of each design element and try to maximize the beneficial uses, because that way one investment in your property is going to result in several different benefits to your life. What can a tree be used for? There's so many things that trees can do. This is just a starting point. It can improve your mental health. It's an attractive feature. You can grow food. You can have a windbreak, medicinal use, firewood, shade, support wildlife, pleasant aromas, privacy screen. It can control erosion. The best way to prevent erosion is by planting that slope that's exposed. Shade. Improve the soil health. What else? This is just a starting point. Start to think creatively about every single thing that you're considering purchasing, especially if it's in your landscape. This is the American persimmon tree. I highly recommend you consider growing it. It's native to this area. It's one of our favorite fruit trees. It's drought tolerant. It's very ornamental. The leaves turn this beautiful bronze color in the fall. You get a significant quantity of fruit that is absolutely delicious in the fall. This is a tree you don't really have to maintain. You don't have to prune it. You don't have to spray it. You don't have to water it once it's established. A few years ago, when there was no fruit on all of the apples and the plums and the peaches because of the late spring temperature fluctuation, every persimmon I saw was fruiting. So that should tell us something. Maybe these are trees that are worth growing, and this is also highly ornamental. What can a greenhouse be used for? Maybe it's just a social space, or maybe this is a space where you're growing food, or maybe this is passive solar heating for your home, and this is like another room of the house. So we built this home-attached greenhouse, and they're able to grow food year-round, and they can open up this door in the middle of winter and let some of that hot air in. And it's also just a fun structure to grow food. So what can a raised bed be used for? In this case, this raised bed is attractive. It's defining a social space. It's functioning as something you can sit against. It's a privacy screen. It's got a lot of functions. We're actually growing mint out of the table in this little built-in planter box. We're growing chives and mint under the benches. You know, how many different things can each design element do for you? How many functions can each design element serve? What can chickens be used for? Chickens can keep weeds down. Chickens can keep disease down around your fruit trees. Chickens can provide eggs. They can provide a source of fertility for your compost. But most people, they think of it as serving one function, just getting eggs. You actually get much more than that. They can be your friends. You know, people have chickens as friends. You know, that's another use. Now, what's this parking lot used for? This is a photo at the Burlington Mall. This is just one use. One use. So many things in our built environment are just serving one use, one function. We need to move past that if we're going to be living more harmoniously with nature. And it's actually more fun to do this. We benefit more when we do this. So if this concept interests you, I recommend checking out permaculture, which stands for permanent agriculture. And it's kind of like a lens for viewing the landscape. It's a design science where you observe nature, you replicate the efficiencies that you find in nature, you mimic nature's patterns, and you're paying attention to details, you're reading the landscapes. What kinds of plants are naturally growing in the area? How healthy do these plants look? What is the nature telling you? So this is something I recommend looking into if you're interested in this concept of stacking functions and really maximizing the efficiency of different construction elements or landscape elements. If you really want to grow food, you need to understand your microclimate. When I was in college, I would look out of my window and I would watch the snow melt, and it would slowly creep more and more and more in one direction. And I could learn a lot about the microclimate and how the sun moved through the space. So while there's still snow on the ground, I encourage you all to look out at your landscape. Where's the snow melting faster? How are you walking through the space? Look at the snow as a way to mark how you're moving through the space and base your designs off of that. So really understand, where is the winter light in your site? How does that move through the space? And in this instance, maybe a greenhouse in this area would be perfect for winter production. You can learn a lot just from observing. Once you understand what you want to grow, what your goals are, a little bit about the microclimate, you need to start thinking about access, because access is a really important concept if you want to grow food or if you want to design a garden that's effective. So sketch out the path layouts, sketch out different ideas, and let the paths dictate the shape of the beds. A lot of our clients, they say, I want this raised bed and I want it here. Okay, well, that's something to consider, but ideally, the way that you move through the space is dictating the shape of the beds. So when I was studying design in school, it was really fitting to be near a space that was very poorly designed. Look at how people are moving through this space. They're creating all of this compaction in the lawn. They're walking through the landscape in a very clear pattern in this kind of X shape. So if you observe the way that people are moving through the space, maybe this would have been a better way to design a hardscape or a pathway. Rather than thinking, this is how I want people to move through the space, think about how are people already moving through the space. And that way you can have a much healthier and better utilized garden space. Same situation here. We would get out of class and we would have to walk through the snow and jump over a bike rack just to get to the dining hall. Because the planners who designed this campus, they neglected to think about how people would actually move through the space. And they wanted people to walk out and around the whole parking lot to get into the space, and that's not how people actually walk. Same situation here. This path over here wasn't wide enough, so there's a lot of compaction, and here there wasn't a path, but students made their own path, and they're actually compacting right near this tree up here. So think about how people are moving through the space right now and base your designs off of that. So how do you move through this space? This was a garden that we designed and installed a couple years ago. There's a nice patio space here to hang out on. There are these stepping stones that you can walk through. And every inch of this garden is accessible when it needs to be. You don't need to trample anything to harvest. Same situation here with these raised beds. If you design a raised bed that's narrow enough that you don't need to step into, you can minimize soil compaction and you can make sure that every inch of your garden is easy to access. How do you move through this space? You drive near it and then you walk through it on the other side. So I have a question for you. What caused more damage to this garden, the salt, the plow, or the snow weight? Any ideas? Who thinks the salt causes the most damage? Who thinks the snow weight causes the most damage? All right, who thinks the plow? It's almost always the plow. So design that in mind. You know, salt is really soluble. It washes out. It can cause damage to evergreens and certain sensitive plants. The snow weight can definitely break branches. But in this case, these were raised beds, and the plow every year just knocks right into them. So you want to design for that. We did not build these out of a fancy stone. We built them out of pressure-treated lumber that can be easily repaired. So try to consider the winter when you're thinking about your landscape. And understand that diversity directly equals resilience. When you see a garden that just has one plant, or when you see a farm that just has one plant, you're going to probably need to use a lot of chemicals to compensate for the added fungus or the added insects or pests that are going to go after that plant. But if you have a farm or a garden that has over 60 different types of plants, like this garden does that we built, you're going to generally be more resilient. You're generally not going to have as many issues with pests. And the more varieties, the more different cultivars, the more diversity that you have, the easier it's going to be to garden. So you're also going to get a wider harvest window. You're also going to get different types of crops. So I highly recommend lots of different plants. And then when you see a farm locally that's growing a lot of different plants, it's hard to do that. It's really hard to be profitable as a farm and grow a lot of different things. So support those farms. Meadow Mist Farm is a great example in Lexington. I highly recommend you check that farm out and you support them because they're growing a lot of different things. They've got trees, they've got edible shrubs, they've got lots of different animals, they have vegetables, herbs, they have a lot of different things going on. So when you see a farm that's growing a lot of different things, recognize that that's hard to do and try to support those farms and design your gardens to be more resilient by incorporating biodiversity into your approach. How are you going to manage weeds? Do you want to use herbicides? Probably not. I don't recommend that. So mulch heavily or plant densely. That's really the best approach. So in this photo, these greens are growing so close together that they actually outcompete the weeds. So give your fruiting plants lots of space, but plant your greens and herbs relatively close together, or your flowers relatively close together so they can outcompete the weeds. And observe nature for inspiration. If you're thinking about how to design your garden or how to lay out your property, who designed this leaf? You know, look at nature and think about why is nature so efficient. This is, if you cut a banana down the center of the stem, this is what the center of the banana looks like, these concentric rings. This is a virus on a gourd. And what's interesting is the shape of the gourd is round, and then the actual virus are these really interesting concentric ring patterns. And so this is a pattern that you see in nature. Maybe you can replicate it in the shape of your beds in your vegetable garden, or maybe you can design a hardscape fire pit or seat wall or patio space designed off of these interesting patterns that you do find in nature. Or maybe you can design a sculpture for your garden with that as an inspiration. So, you know, look up at the moon, look at seed pods, look at how mushrooms grow, look at how things are surviving in nature, and then emulate that with gentle curves in the landscape or with the way that you're thinking about approaching a garden design project. And you find straight lines in nature too. So in this case, this is sand and how it makes that pattern. and this is a cell wall. So you find straight lines in nature, and there's a time and a place where straight lines are actually more appropriate. If you're working with a rectilinear space, be parallel with those lines. You know, curving lines and everything spiraling doesn't always make sense. We're often dealing with right angles, so incorporate that where it's appropriate. Replicate patterns in nature where appropriate. So one of these photos is of a lung, one of these photos is of a tree, and one of these photos is of a river delta. And replicate patterns in nature where it's appropriate and learn to identify these natural patterns. So maybe you could take this concept and apply it to a hierarchy of paths in your garden. You have a central path, and maybe that's for foot traffic or for using a wheelbarrow, or maybe that's where you drive your pickup truck, and then you have these side paths that are used less frequently, and that's where you go to harvest your greens or your herbs. So start thinking about how plants are efficient. How are trees efficient? How does water move through the landscape? And monitor these efficiencies, and then try to apply that to your own garden, because your garden's going to be more beautiful, more harmonious in the landscape as a result. And then you start to realize that the same patterns are seen at all levels and all scales. And the way that a hurricane forms, or the way that our fingerprint looks, or the way that the galaxy spirals, it's actually all the same patterns. If you're interested in this, I recommend looking at the Fibonacci sequence or the golden ratio. You see it in the way cream blends with your coffee. You see it in the way that sunflower seeds emanate, or the way that shells form, or the way that the tendrils on your cucumber plant grow. So these patterns are found all throughout nature, and they can make your garden more beautiful as a result. Albert Einstein said, "Look deep into nature and you will understand everything." Nature is the best teacher. It's been said that nature holds the original patent on every human invention. If we look to the way nature does things, we'll get the most efficient, energy-conserving, and beautiful result. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. The world is not to be put in order. The world is in order. It is for us to put ourselves in unison with this order. Thank you. You know, this is the essence of this whole presentation. It's like, how do we fit in to the natural world rather than just killing it, which is what we're doing. And there is a way to do it, and it starts one fruit tree at a time. It starts one interested person at a time. It starts with one experience at a time, interacting with nature. And all these little things, they really do add up. They really are significant. And I love this slide because this is a very sustainable concept. This is where I went to college. This garden received national recognition. This is in the heart of the campus. And these students wanted to catch water in these very visible water tanks, and they were trying to stack functions, or they were, by growing things on them, but it wasn't done in a very beautiful way. So sometimes a concept that seems sustainable or may be sustainable might actually not be sustainable if it's not executed professionally or if it's not executed in a beautiful way. So make sure that what you're doing is attractive, because if you're doing something that's interesting and maybe a little unique, but is ultimately positive, and your neighbor sees it, if it's beautiful, your neighbor might want to replicate that. And that's how these ideas spread. So make sure what you're doing is attractive, because all of the ideas we're talking about here, they can be positive, they can be regenerative, they can yield high yields of organic produce, but it needs to be beautiful, especially if it's in the front yard, especially in this case if it's in the heart of campus. So take aesthetics seriously, because a lot of people, that's all they see at first, and then they can dig a little deeper and realize the other benefits that can come from these types of gardens. Sustainable and edible gardens can be beautiful, and they can be inspiring. So it's our duty to make it beautiful and inspiring, and it's actually not that hard to do if you put the right plants in the right place. So I want to briefly talk about some of our favorite plants. We love Asian pears. These are plants that do really well here. We don't spray any of our fruit trees, so we're relying on trees that are generally easy to grow. These are awesome plants. I highly recommend you grow them in full sun. Generally, fruit trees want full sun. Pawpaws, one of the only exceptions. You can grow this in part sun. This is a native fruit tree. It's like the size of a mango. It's absolutely delicious. It's really hard to find in the grocery store or the farmer's market because it doesn't have a long shelf life. So you probably won't find it in the grocery store, but it's worth growing because this is a tree that requires very little attention once it's up and running, and you'll get these really delicious tropical tasting fruits as a result. The American persimmon, an awesome fruit tree, really easy to grow. You just walk up to the tree and you shake it, and then all the ripe fruit will fall, and it's really a fun thing to harvest. And it's absolutely delicious. It's really sweet, highly nutritious. This is a photo of a mature persimmon tree with the farmer actually shaking the tree, and like 30 persimmon fell right at that moment. That was a fun moment interacting with that tree. Grapes, I definitely recommend growing grapes. Grow it on your chain link fence that's doing nothing other than being a fence, and turn it into something else. Nut trees. We should be growing more chestnuts and more walnuts. These are trees that do really well here. They require very little work, and you get a significant yield. These are also really big, beautiful trees. Blueberries. I don't want to see any more privet hedges. I want to see blueberry hedges, because you actually get something out of it. You get these beautiful flowers, you get this fall foliage, and then you get blueberries. So these are things that we should be growing, and these are relatively easy to grow. Raspberries, even easier to grow. We should all be growing raspberries or plums, or really all of these plants. I recommend starting small, start with somewhere on your landscape, but give it a shot, because it's quite enjoyable. Strawberries, this is a great ground cover to consider in your garden. Garlic as an annual, awesome crop. It grows really well in this area. It's medicinal, it's delicious. Everyone likes garlic. Microgreens, these are plants that can only take about 3 weeks or 4 weeks from sowing the seed to harvest. So this is a fast turnaround crop. As soon as the snow melts, maybe some of you have raised beds where the snow's already melted. Go sow microgreens today. It's not too early to get some spinach or some arugula or some tatsoi or bok choy in the ground. Now's a great time, or early spring is a great time for these types of crops. Any sort of annuals, try them out, experiment. Have some failures and mistakes and learn from them. With annuals, you can't go wrong, because they're annuals. Pollinators and medicinal plants. So what I've learned recently is, fortunately, most of the medicinal plants that we really love are also pollinators. They also benefit pollinator, like bees and butterflies and that kind of thing. So we can benefit the surrounding ecosystem, and we can benefit ourselves at the same time. So I recommend learning about medicinal herbs and culinary herbs, and then benefit the pollinators as well. If you're limited with space, try indoor gardens. Try growing next to a window. Try indoor-outdoor plants, plants that you overwinter inside and then you bring it out on your balcony, like figs, for example. So nature is resilient. If you haven't caught that yet, nature is resilient, and connecting with nature is very important. And growing your own food, it's the most sustainable option. I've been doing this 10 years now, and I found that there's a sort of transformation that happens when people start growing their own food. They start thinking about their landscape differently. They start thinking about the potential of their property differently. They start seeing common spaces differently. It starts to become a real question as to why more people aren't growing their own food, because it's fun and because you can gain so much from it. And it really is the most sustainable option. I mean, imagine growing your own cherry tomatoes versus having them shipped from 1,000 miles away, or from the other side of the country, or from another country in general. And it's fun. It really is fun to grow your own food. It's fun to go out at the end of the day and harvest your own food. There's just so many problems in the world right now. And every time you look at the news, there's more and more problems. But when you go into your garden, you get a little moment where those problems kind of go away. And I don't know if anyone ever has experienced that, but a garden's like a sanctuary. And when you have that moment, it's memorable, and that impact is positive. In gardening, it allows us to take back the power. We're not victims here. Don't hope for someone else to come in and make everything better for us. It's up to us to act and to lead. And it starts with what we do on our own properties. It starts with how we engage with our own homes and our own landscapes. So before we criticize the state of the world and the state of the environment, it's important that we do as much as we possibly can to make our own properties as sustainable as possible. And it might start with a raised bed and a few experiences that are really positive, engaging with your garden or teaching your children about that process. Or it might start with just planting a few fruit trees. But the baby steps, they add up. And if enough of us do it, that's how we change this paradigm into one that's more connected with nature and harmonious with nature. So the ultimate goal of farming, it's not actually the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings. We become better in the process of growing food. This is by a man named Masanobu Fukuoka. He wrote a book called One Straw Revolution. And the goal of farming in his mind is really about how do we better ourselves in this process. And just start. That's the best thing I can tell you, is just get something in the ground. Start making mistakes now if you're going to do it yourself. And that's great. You can learn a lot that way. And remember, all the world's problems can be solved in a garden. I want to end on that note. So thank you so much for coming.